You ever get one of those calls where you feel like saying no, but something tells you it's going to be worth it? That's how it started for me. My Aunt Linda called out of the blue, asking if I could watch her dog, Max, for the weekend. Max is this big, muscular German shepherd, the kind of dog you'd want on your side in a dark alley. She and Uncle Rob were heading to some winery for their anniversary, and their usual dog sitter bailed. "Ethan, it's just 2 nights. He's super chill. You'll barely notice he's there," she said. And then she added the kicker. "You can stay at the house, it'll be like a mini vacation. We even stocked the fridge." Now, I'm a broke college student, so free food and a house that doesn't smell like sweaty roommates? Sign me up. When I got there Friday evening, the place looked like something out of one of those home improvement shows. Huge windows, pristine white walls, a living room you're almost scared to sit in. Max greeted me with a wagging tail and this intense stare like he was sizing me up. Linda showed me around, pointing out where Max's food was and giving me the Wi-Fi password. She also mentioned the security cameras inside the house. "Just so you know, they're motion activated. You won't even notice them," she said. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, that detail should have raised a red flag. Once they left, Max and I settled in. He followed me everywhere, like my shadow. I was enjoying the peace and quiet until I noticed Max staring at the dark hallway that led to the basement. He wasn't barking or growling, just staring, like he could see something I couldn't. It gave me the creeps, but I brushed it off. Dogs are weird sometimes, right? Later that night, I grabbed some snacks and headed down to the game room in the basement. This house had everything: a massive TV, a pool table, even a mini bar. I was halfway through a round of some zombie shooter game when Max started acting up. He stood at the top of the basement stairs, growling low and steady, his ears pinned back. "Come on, Max, don't be weird," I called out, but he didn't budge. I paused the game and walked over to him. He was staring at the door to the boiler room, his growl getting louder. My heart was racing now. It was probably just the house settling or the water heater kicking on, but in that moment, every scary movie I'd ever seen came flooding back. I walked over and pushed the door open. The boiler room was small, just some pipes, a water heater, and a stack of old paint cans. Nothing out of the ordinary. "See, buddy, nothing here," I said, trying to sound calm. Max didn't seem convinced. He kept his distance from the door, his growl now more of a whine. That's when I noticed something, a faint metallic smell in the air. It reminded me of pennies, but stronger. I decided I'd had enough of the basement for one night. Back in the guest room, I tried to shake off the weird vibes. Max curled up at the foot of the bed, but his ears kept twitching like he was still on high alert. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a soft creak, like someone stepping on an old wooden floor. My eyes shot open and Max was already on his feet, staring at the closet door. The door was ajar, just a crack, but it was enough to see a sliver of darkness. My breath caught in my throat. "It's just the AC or something," I whispered to myself. But even I didn't believe that. Max started growling again, low and guttural. I reached for my phone, its light barely cutting through the shadows. Slowly, I got out of bed and inched toward the closet, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I swear I heard it, a faint, raspy breath like someone was trying to stay quiet. That's when I saw it, an eye, a human eye, staring back at me through the darkness. I froze, my mind racing. Then instinct kicked in. I grabbed Max by the collar, bolted out of the room, and didn't stop running until we were outside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. "Someone's in the house," I stammered to the operator. I was standing in the driveway, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. Max was at my side, his tail low, his ears pinned back, but his eyes were locked on the house. It was like he could still sense whatever was inside. My hands were shaking as I held my phone, trying to give the 911 operator the address. "The house is empty," I told her, my voice barely steady. "I mean, it's supposed to be, but someone's in there. I saw an eye." I felt stupid the moment I said it. An eye? It sounded insane, but I knew what I saw. The operator told me to stay put and assured me the police were on their way. I looked back at the house. It was so still, so normal looking. The soft glow of the porch light and the perfect landscaping didn't match the horror of what was happening inside. Then I saw it, a shadow move across one of the upstairs windows. My stomach dropped. Whoever was in there wasn't hiding anymore. They were moving around like they owned the place. It felt like an eternity, but finally I heard the sound of sirens. 2 squad cars pulled up, lights flashing, and a pair of officers stepped out. They asked me to explain everything, but I could barely get the words out. There's someone inside. I saw them in the closet, and Max kept acting like something was wrong all night. One of the officers nodded and motioned to his partner. They pulled out their flashlights and entered the house, leaving me outside with a third officer. I stood there gripping Max's leash so tight my fingers went numb. The officer tried to make small talk, but my mind was somewhere else. What if they didn't find anything? What if whoever was in there got away? After what felt like hours, the officers came back out. They didn't look as calm as when they went in. "We didn't find anyone," one of them said, but his tone wasn't reassuring. "There are signs someone's been here, though. A window in the basement is unlocked, and we found muddy footprints leading to the pantry." The pantry? My blood ran cold. I hadn't gone near the pantry all weekend. That meant someone had been moving around while I was there, probably watching me the whole time. The officers asked if the house had security cameras. That's when I remembered Linda mentioning them. I gave them access to the system, and we all crowded around one of their laptops as they pulled up the footage. The first few clips were normal, just me and Max moving around. But then, around midnight, things got weird. The motion detector in the hallway outside my room went off. At first, there was nothing but an empty corridor. Then, a figure stepped into view. My heart stopped. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. He moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if he knew where the cameras were. At one point, he stopped right outside the guest room door and just stood there, watching. Max let out a low growl as if he recognized the figure on the screen. The officers exchanged looks, and one of them spoke into his radio, calling for backup. "We're dealing with a squatter," he said, but his voice was tense, or worse. That's when I remembered something else. "Check the boiler room," I blurted out. Max was acting weird about it earlier. One of the officers nodded and went back inside. A few minutes later, he came out, his face pale. "Found something," he said quietly. "A bedroll, food wrappers, a knife." A knife. My legs felt like jelly. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't just hiding. He was preparing for something, and I had been sleeping just a few feet away. The officer's words hit me like a punch to the gut. A knife. That meant whoever had been in the house wasn't just squatting. They had plans. I glanced at Max, who was still tense, his eyes locked on the front door like he was waiting for something. The officers didn't ask me to go back inside, and I was glad because there was no way I was stepping foot in that house again. The backup arrived, a couple more officers and a K-9 unit. They moved quickly, sweeping the house room by room. I stood there in the cold, gripping Max's leash and staring at the windows, half expecting to see that shadowy figure again. After what felt like forever, one of the officers came back out and called me over. "We've cleared the main floors, but the basement's another story. There's a crawl space down there. Looks like someone's been using it as a hideout." A crawl space? My stomach churned. I thought about all the times I'd been alone in that basement, playing games or walking around completely unaware that someone could have been just a few feet away. The officer gestured for me to stay back, but I couldn't help but watch as they descended into the basement. Their flashlights danced against the walls, revealing corners I'd never paid attention to before. Then I heard it, a shout, followed by a scuffle. Max started barking like crazy, and I could hear muffled yelling. A few moments later, they brought him out. The man was thin, with wild hair and bloodshot eyes. He was struggling against the officers, shouting incoherently about needing the house, and it was supposed to be his. My skin crawled. He looked feral, like someone who hadn't been around people in a long time. But what scared me the most was how deliberate his movements had been on the security footage. This guy wasn't crazy. He was calculating. The man was cuffed and shoved into the back of a squad car, but my relief didn't last long. One of the officers came over and handed me a card. "We'll need you to give a statement tomorrow," he said. "And you might want to have someone stay with you tonight." I nodded, but inside I was spiraling. What if Max hadn't been there? What if I hadn't seen that eye in the closet? My aunt and uncle had no idea how close their quiet weekend had come to being a complete nightmare. I called them to let them know what happened, and they were horrified. Linda kept apologizing over and over, even though it wasn't her fault. After the police left, I took Max to my car and sat there for a while, trying to process everything. My mind kept going back to the knife they'd found. The guy had been watching me, waiting for the right moment. And if Max hadn't been so alert, that moment might have come. When I finally worked up the courage to go back into the house, I didn't last long. Every creak, every shadow made my heart race. I ended up sleeping in my car with Max curled up beside me, his head resting on my lap like he knew I needed the comfort. The next morning, the house felt different. It was still beautiful, still pristine, but it no longer felt safe. The police had come back to check the crawl space and collect more evidence, and they told me something that sent shivers down my spine. The man had been in the house for at least 3 days, before I even got there. He'd been living in the crawl space, sneaking out at night to move around. The pantry, the boiler room, even the guest room closet. He'd been everywhere. The officers told me I was lucky to have Max. Without him, they weren't sure how things would have ended. When my aunt and uncle got back later that day, they were shaken. Uncle Rob promised to install better locks and get rid of the crawl space entirely. Linda hugged me and Max about a dozen times, tears in her eyes. "I can't believe this happened," she kept saying. I wish I could say I walked away from the whole thing unscathed, but that'd be a lie. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep without checking every closet and locking every door at least twice. Even now, I get chills thinking about that eye staring back at me from the closet. But there's one thing I know for sure. Max saved my life. He might just be a dog, but that weekend he was my guardian. And I'll never forget it. You ever take a job thinking, this is going to be the easiest money I've ever made, only to regret it the second things go south? That's how this all started. I was 16, desperate for cash to fix my old bike, and Mrs. Bellamy, my creepy neighbor, offered me a job watching her dog, Scout, while she went on some spiritual retreat. The pay? $100 for a week. The catch? I had to stay in her house. She said Scout didn't adjust well to being alone, whatever that meant. I wasn't thrilled, but hey, it's just a dog. When I walked into her house, though, I felt off. It smelled faintly of mothballs and something metallic. Every wall was packed with antique clocks, dusty books, and weird trinkets, like the house hadn't been touched since the 50s. Mrs. Bellamy herself was strange, too. She had this way of staring at you, like she was trying to see inside your skull. She gave me a list of rules. Never leave Scout alone. Lock all the doors and windows at night. Under no circumstances should I go into the basement. Why not the basement? I asked. Her expression darkened. There are things down there. Things that don't like to be disturbed. I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. The first night, everything was fine. Scout barked a little, but he settled down when I gave him a treat. I spent most of the night scrolling on my phone, ignoring how quiet the house felt. But the second night, that's when things started getting weird. Scout wouldn't stop growling at the basement door. At first, I thought he was just being a dog, but then I heard it. A faint tapping sound, like knuckles rapping on wood. Probably just the wind, I told myself. But Scout wouldn't calm down. His growls turned into frantic barks, and I swear I heard something faint, like a whisper. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But the tapping wouldn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, like someone, or something, was knocking from the other side. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen, my hands shaking. "Stay here, Scout," I whispered. though he was already clawing at the basement door like a maniac. When I pulled back the old rug in front of the door, I froze. Scratched into the wood were strange symbols like something out of a horror movie. They didn't look random. They looked like warnings, but I was too curious, or too stupid to stop. I unlocked the door and opened it slowly. A gust of cold, damp air hit me, and I gagged. It smelled like mold and rust. "Scout," I called as he bolted down the stairs. The flashlight's beam barely cut through the darkness as I followed. The basement was larger than I expected, with low, uneven ceilings. The walls were covered in more symbols, drawn in what looked like dried blood. Scout stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at a small wooden box on the floor. His growls turned into whimpers as the lid of the box creaked open on its own. And then I saw it. A hand. Not just any hand. A grotesque, pale thing with blackened nails. It reached out from inside the box, clawing at the air as if searching for something. I screamed, grabbing Scout by the collar, but the hand didn't stop. It dragged itself forward, pulling the rest of its body out of the box. The thing was twisted and gaunt, its eyes sunken and lifeless. "Why? Did you open the door?" It rasped. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I bolted up the stairs, dragging Scout behind me. The whispers followed, growing louder, filling my head with words I didn't understand. I slammed the basement door shut and threw the lock, my heart pounding in my ears. The next morning, I called the cops. I wasn't about to spend another second in that house without backup. When they arrived, I explained everything. I could tell they didn't believe me, but they humored me anyway. 2 officers went down into the basement while I waited outside, clutching Scout like a lifeline. 10 minutes later, they came back up pale and shaken. "There's something down there," one of them muttered. "Symbols, old bones, and that box, but no sign of anyone or anything." When Mrs. Bellamy returned that evening, I confronted her. "What the hell is in your basement?" I demanded. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked sad. "I told you not to open it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The box was meant to keep it contained. Now it's loose." "What's loose?" I asked, but she wouldn't answer. That was the last time I saw Mrs. Bellamy. A week later, her house was abandoned. No forwarding address, no explanation, just gone. But the whispers, they didn't leave. Even now, years later, I still hear them sometimes. Late at night, when everything's quiet, they creep into my dreams, soft and haunting. And every time I hear a tap on wood, I wonder if it's coming back for me. You ever do a favor for a friend thinking it'll be easy only to end up in the worst situation of your life? Yeah, that's how I learned to never say yes without asking a million questions first. It all started when Jamie got this last-minute dog-sitting gig for a family who had to leave town. She practically dragged me into it, saying, "Come on, it's just a weekend and the dog's cute. Plus, I'll owe you big time." Jamie's great at making things sound harmless, and I didn't have much going on, so I agreed. The house was in the suburbs, surrounded by these tall trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. It wasn't old or creepy, but something about it felt wrong. Too quiet, maybe? Jamie unlocked the door, and as soon as we stepped inside, the smell of pine cleaner hit me like a punch. Everything was spotless. Too spotless. Then we met Max. He was massive, an all-black German shepherd with eyes so sharp it felt like he was looking through me. He didn't bark or wag his tail, just stared at us like we were intruding. "He's sweet, right?" Jamie said, her voice wavering. I didn't answer. That first night, Max wouldn't stop pacing. He kept walking to the window, staring into the dark and growling low. I joked that he must have seen a squirrel, but Jamie wasn't laughing. "Maybe he's protecting us," she whispered. From what, I didn't want to know. By the second day, Jamie was jittery, and Max seemed more restless than ever. "Let's take him for a walk," she said, grabbing his leash. I wasn't thrilled about it, but the tension in the house was unbearable. The neighborhood had this eerie charm. The houses were spread out, and the trees cast long shadows over the sidewalks. As we walked, Max started acting weird. He froze, his ears perked, staring into the woods like he'd seen something. Jamie tugged the leash. "Come on, Max, there's nothing there." But he wouldn't move. Then I smelled it, something foul, like rotting meat. Jamie covered her nose. "What the hell is that?" she muttered. Before I could respond, Max bolted. He yanked the leash out of Jamie's hand and tore off toward the road. We ran after him, shouting his name, but the screech of tires cut us off. Max was lying in the street, motionless. A car sped off into the distance, its taillights disappearing. Jamie fell to her knees, sobbing. I felt numb as we carried his body back to the house and buried him under an old oak tree in the backyard. That night, I heard scratching. Soft at first, then louder, like claws scraping wood. When I checked, there was nothing there, just the dark backyard and the faint smell of decay. The next morning, Jamie was pale and quiet, her eyes darting to every sound. Over breakfast, she whispered, "I think I heard him last night." "Heard what?" I asked, my voice low. "Max, I heard his nails on the floor. I swear it sounded just like him." I didn't know what to say. The thought of it sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off. "You're stressed. It's just your mind playing tricks on you." But later that day, Jamie screamed from the living room. I ran in and she was pointing at the window, trembling. "He's there," she whispered. I looked, and my heart nearly stopped. Max was outside, limping across the yard. His fur was matted with mud, and his eyes were different. They glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. We ran outside, but by the time we got there, he was gone. No paw prints, no sign he'd been there at all. Jamie grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Tell me you saw him. Tell me I'm not crazy." "You're not crazy," I muttered. "But we might be in trouble." That night, the house came alive with sounds. Scratching on the windows, low growls echoing through the halls. At one point, we heard something thud against the front door. Jamie and I huddled in the living room, all the lights on, clutching whatever we could find as weapons. She had a kitchen knife. I had the fireplace poker. Around 2 a.m., the smell hit us. That same rotten stench from the woods, thick and suffocating. Then we heard it, the faint jingling of Max's collar. Jamie's face was pale as a sheet. "He's inside," she whispered. I didn't want to believe it, but the sound was getting closer. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hall toward us. I tightened my grip on the poker and stepped into the hallway. "Max?" My voice cracked. Nothing. Just darkness. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Max stood at the end of the hall, his body distorted, his fur missing in patches. His eyes glowed brighter, burning into me. He opened his mouth, and the growl that came out sounded almost human. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut. Jamie was sobbing, and I could feel my own fear bubbling over. "This isn't real," I muttered, trying to convince myself. "This can't be real." The next morning, Jamie called the owners and told them everything. There was a long silence on the other end before the wife finally said, "Max died 3 months ago." Jamie froze. "What?" "But he's here. We buried him ourselves." The wife's voice shook. "No, you don't understand. Max died, but strange things started happening after we buried him. That's why we left. We thought it would stop." We stared at each other, horrified. I hung up the phone and turned to Jamie. "They knew," I said. "They knew this was going to happen." We searched the house for answers, and that's when we found Max's collar in the living room. It wasn't there before, and neither of us had touched it. When I picked it up, it felt ice cold. The room grew darker, and the smell of decay returned. Then from the shadows, Max appeared again, his body more grotesque than before. He lunged at us and we ran, locking ourselves in the bedroom. Max didn't stop. He scratched at the door, growled, and thudded against it like he was trying to break it down. Jamie was hysterical, screaming that we had to leave. I wasn't sure we'd make it. When the noises finally stopped, we crept out of the room. The house was eerily silent, but as we reached the front door, Max appeared in front of us, blocking our path. His form flickered, like static on a TV, and his eyes burned with rage. I don't know how, but I grabbed the collar and threw it at him. Max let out a horrible guttural scream and vanished into the air, leaving only the faint smell of decay. We didn't look back. Jamie moved out that day, and I followed a week later. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that Max isn't gone. Sometimes late at night I hear the faint jingle of a collar or the soft scratching of claws, and every time I wonder if he's waiting for me to come back. When I was around 17, I used to do dog sitting for a family I'd known for years. They were a nice couple with a little boy, about 3 years old, and 2 big German shepherds named Max and Luna. They'd take these fancy vacations twice a year and would always call me to watch the dogs in their house while they were gone. It was a good gig, easy money, a huge house, and I got to hang out with 2 awesome dogs. Their house, it was massive. I'm talking the kind of big that makes you feel like you're in a maze. Every time I stayed there, I'd stumble upon a new part of the house I hadn't noticed before. An extra bathroom, a weird storage closet, stuff like that. The place was tucked way back from the main road, surrounded by tall trees, so it felt kind of isolated even though it was technically in a decent neighborhood. It was December, just before Christmas, when they asked me to house sit again. I didn't mind. School was out for the holidays, and I figured it was a good way to make some extra cash. Plus, I got the house to myself for a few days. Win-win, right? The routine was simple. I'd get the mail, feed the dogs, play with them a bit, and basically just chill. They told me I could eat whatever I found in the fridge and use the big TV in their living room. Honestly, it was better than being stuck at home. The only downside? The house was over an hour from mine, so I usually just stayed overnight. It saved me from having to drive back and forth twice a day. The first night started off like any other. I fed Max and Luna, tossed a ball around in the backyard with them, and then settled on the couch to watch a movie. They had this huge flat-screen TV, so I couldn't resist binge-watching some action flicks. By the time the third movie ended, I was exhausted. I grabbed my bag and headed to one of the guest bedrooms. As usual, Max and Luna followed me, plopping down on the floor like my personal bodyguards. It was kind of comforting having them around. After scrolling through my phone for a bit, I turned off the lights and tried to sleep. Now, I've never been great at falling asleep in new places. Something about the unfamiliar creaks and sounds of a house always keeps me awake. I lay there for about half an hour just staring at the ceiling, when I noticed both dogs suddenly lift their heads at the exact same time. They were staring at the bedroom door, completely still. No barking, no growling, just staring. I didn't hear anything, but the way they were acting gave me this uneasy feeling, like they knew something I didn't. I whispered, "What's wrong, guys?" But they didn't move. Then faintly, I heard it. A soft creaking sound, like a floorboard being stepped on. It was coming from somewhere down the hall. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. It could have been nothing, maybe just the house settling, but something about it felt off. Max let out a low growl, and that's when I knew I wasn't imagining things. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer, just silence. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it around the room. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. I tried convincing myself it was nothing, just my imagination messing with me. But Max and Luna wouldn't stop staring at the door. I decided to get up and check things out. Grabbing my phone and a small flashlight I'd brought, I quietly opened the bedroom door. The hallway was pitch black. Every creak of the floor under my feet sounded louder than it should have. Max and Luna followed close behind, sticking to me like glue. I checked each room, one by one. Nothing. Everything seemed fine. When I got to the living room, though, I noticed something strange. On the coffee table was this baby monitor. I hadn't noticed it before, but it must have been there all along. The family didn't have a baby anymore, at least not one they mentioned. So why did they even have this thing? Curious, I picked it up. The screen was on, but it was just static, like an old TV stuck on a dead channel. I tried turning it off, but it wouldn't respond. Just then, the static changed. It wasn't random fuzz anymore. It was a faint rhythmic sound like footsteps. I froze. The sound was coming from somewhere in the house. Switching through the monitor's controls, I saw it was connected to several cameras around the house. One was labeled basement. My thumb hovered over the button for a second before I pressed it. The screen changed to show the basement, a dark, unfinished space. At first, it looked empty. Then, in the corner of the screen, something moved. A figure. It was crouched low, barely visible in the shadows. It wasn't just my eyes playing tricks on me. Someone or something was down there. My first instinct was to call the cops, but my hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the monitor. The dogs, as if sensing my fear, started growling. Their deep guttural sounds made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stared at the screen, hoping whatever I saw was gone, but it wasn't. The figure moved again, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't like someone just pacing around, it was like they were waiting for something. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. Against all logic, I decided to go check the basement. I told myself I'd grab the dogs, get my stuff, and leave as soon as possible. But something about it felt personal, like whoever was down there wanted me to see them. The basement door was at the far end of the house, near the kitchen. As I approached it, the air felt heavier, like walking through a fog of dread. Max and Luna were right by my side, their growls growing louder. I hesitated at the top of the stairs. The light switch didn't work. Of course it didn't. I shined my flashlight down the steps, but the beam only pierced the darkness halfway. "Who's down there?" I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. Step by step I descended, my heart pounding in my ears. The dogs stayed behind me, but they didn't bark. It was like they knew barking would make things worse. When I reached the bottom, the smell hit me first, stale air mixed with something metallic. Blood? The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and random junk. But in the far corner, where the camera had shown the figure, there was nothing, just an empty space. Or so I thought. As I turned to leave, my flashlight caught movement in the corner of my eye. The figure was there, now standing. It wore a dark hood that obscured its face, but I could feel its gaze locked onto me, and then it moved. Fast. Straight toward me. I didn't think, I just ran. Max and Luna bolted up the stairs ahead of me, their claws scraping against the wood as they scrambled for traction. My legs felt like jelly, but adrenaline kept me moving. I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps behind me closing in fast. Slamming the basement door shut, I locked it and pressed my back against it, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The dogs were barking like crazy now, their eyes fixed on the door as if they knew whatever was behind it wasn't human. I grabbed my bag from the bedroom and shoved in what little I had brought. There was no way I was sticking around to find out who or what that was. My car keys were in my pocket and I clutched them so hard they dug into my palm. The sound of pounding came from the other side of the basement door. It wasn't frantic. It was slow and deliberate, like whoever was there wanted me to know they could break it down whenever they felt like it. "Come on, guys," I whispered to Max and Luna, trying to keep my voice steady. We headed for the front door, but as I reached for the handle, I froze. The figure was outside now, standing in the driveway. Its hood was still up, and even though I couldn't see its face, I felt its eyes boring into me. I backed away, realizing the only way out was through the window in the guest bedroom. I hurried back to the room, opened the window, and climbed out, Max and Luna right behind me. The icy air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. Once we were outside, I sprinted to my car. My hands fumbled with the keys, and for a horrifying moment, I thought I'd drop them. But I managed to unlock the door, and we all piled in. As I started the car, I looked back at the house. The figure was gone. I drove as fast as I could, the trees blurring past me on the dark, winding road. Max and Luna were in the back seat, whining and pacing, just as shaken as I was. My hands were trembling so much I could barely keep the wheel steady. When I finally got far enough away, I pulled over and called the family. I must have sounded insane, babbling about a hooded figure in the basement, but I didn't care. They didn't answer, so I left a voicemail telling them everything. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down. My mind was racing with questions. Who was that? How did they get in? And why didn't they hurt me? By the time I got home, it was nearly dawn. I locked every door and window in my house and sat on my bed with the dogs, too scared to sleep. Later that day, I got a text from the family. They thanked me for letting them know what happened and assured me everything was fine. "There's nothing unusual here," they wrote. "The house is exactly how we left it, except for the dogs being locked in the guest room. You must have imagined it." Imagined it? No way. I knew what I saw. A few weeks later, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, so I did some digging. I searched for anything about the house's history and eventually found an old news article. Turns out the previous owner was a recluse who had been obsessed with monitoring his family. He'd installed cameras all over the house, even in places they didn't know about. One day, he just disappeared. No one knew where he went, but some locals believed he never really left. I wanted to forget about it, to move on, but the memory of that hooded figure wouldn't let me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it standing there watching. The family asked me to dog sit again a few months later. They offered more money this time, but I didn't care. I politely refused. Some things aren't worth the money. I'm 22, and about 2 weeks ago, my aunt asked me if I could dog sit for her while she attended a work conference. My aunt's cabin is tucked away in the Montana wilderness, completely isolated, surrounded by snowy woods that stretch for miles. She has this huge Malamute named Max. He's big, fluffy, and looks like he belongs on the cover of an Alaskan travel brochure. I'd never taken care of Max before, but my aunt reassured me he was easy. All I had to do was feed him, let him outside, and make sure he stayed safe. Honestly, I jumped at the chance. Life in the city had been overwhelming, and the idea of spending a few days in the peace and quiet of her cabin sounded perfect. But there was no way I was doing it alone. I asked my best friend Tyler to come with me. He's the kind of guy who can turn any situation into an adventure, and I figured he'd make the whole trip way more fun. When we got to the cabin, it felt like stepping into a postcard. The place was small but cozy, with wooden beams and a stone fireplace. The snow blanketed everything outside, making the woods look both magical and a little eerie. Max greeted us like we were his long-lost packmates, wagging his tail so hard he almost knocked over a lamp. The first 2 days were peaceful. Tyler and I took Max for walks, played games, and spent our evenings by the fire. It snowed a lot, but we didn't mind. The quiet was exactly what I needed. But by the second night, Max started acting differently. While we were walking him through the woods, he stopped suddenly and stared into the trees, his ears pinned back. At first, I thought it was a deer or something, but he let out this low, rumbling growl. It wasn't like him. Max was usually super friendly, even to strangers. Tyler laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. That night, while we were playing cards in the kitchen, we heard footsteps outside. It wasn't the soft crunch of an animal. It sounded like heavy boots. Tyler froze mid-hand. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded and grabbed the flashlight. Max was already by the door, his hackles raised and his barking loud enough to shake the walls. When I opened the door and shone the flashlight into the snow, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, big ones, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. The tracks were fresh, the snow still slightly disturbed around them. Tyler stepped outside behind me, peering over my shoulder. "Dude, those weren't there earlier," he said. "No kidding," I muttered, my breath clouding in the freezing air. Max barked again, pulling against his leash like he wanted to chase after whoever, or whatever, had left those tracks. Against my better judgment, I followed them, Tyler reluctantly tagging along. The tracks led about 30 feet into the woods before stopping abruptly. There was no sign of anyone. It was like whoever made them had just vanished. Tyler muttered something about going back inside, and I didn't argue. The whole situation was starting to feel wrong. When we got back to the cabin, I triple-checked the locks on the doors and windows. Max wouldn't settle down. He kept pacing, occasionally stopping to growl at the door. Tyler tried to lighten the mood by putting on a movie, but even he couldn't hide how freaked out he was. By the time the storm really picked up, the cabin felt more like a prison than a retreat. The wind howled like a wild animal, rattling the windows, and the snow fell so thick it erased the world outside. We decided to call it a night, but I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear the wind, or was it footsteps, and my mind would conjure up images of someone out there in the dark. At around 2 a.m., Max started barking again. This time it was frantic. Tyler and I jumped out of bed and rushed to the window. Through the swirling snow, we saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees. They weren't moving, just standing there watching. I grabbed the rifle my aunt kept by the door and pointed the flashlight toward the figure. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. They didn't even flinch. Tyler tugged on my sleeve. "Dude, let's just go back inside. Lock the door." But I couldn't look away. The figure was holding something, a large bag slung over their shoulder. My pulse was racing as a million thoughts ran through my mind. Who was this person? Why were they here? What was in the bag? Then, as if they'd been waiting for me to act, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. I couldn't see where they went. The storm swallowed them up like a curtain falling over a stage. Tyler and I bolted the door and started packing our stuff. "We're leaving," I said, my voice firm. "Now." Max was whimpering as we grabbed our bags and headed for the car. The snow had piled up high, making it hard to walk, but we pushed through. When we finally got inside and started the engine, the headlights lit up the driveway. And there he was. The figure was standing just beyond the car, motionless, his face obscured by shadows. "Go!" Tyler shouted. I slammed on the gas and the tires spun for a moment before catching. We sped down the driveway and onto the forest road, the figure disappearing into the blizzard behind us. For a while I thought we were safe. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him again, standing in the middle of the road, impossibly far from where we'd left him, watching us as we drove away. We made it to a small diner on the edge of town, where we called the police. They promised to check the cabin, but when my aunt got back the next day, she told me they hadn't found anyone. Just footprints everywhere, circling the cabin over and over. I don't know who or what that man was, and I don't think I want to know. When I was in high school, money was always tight. My mom worked as a cleaner, which meant she cleaned houses for people who could afford to pay decently. Most of these houses were massive and expensive, and sometimes the owners would even become friendly with her. One of her regular clients was this older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. They didn't have kids, but their house was straight out of a magazine, huge, with a pool that me and my siblings loved. Whenever my mom cleaned there, we'd tag along, spending hours swimming while she worked. One summer, the Wilsons told my mom they were going on vacation for a week. They needed someone to watch their dogs, Max, an old golden retriever, and Luna, a hyper-husky mix they'd recently adopted. Luna was a handful. She'd jump fences, chew on furniture, and bolt out the door every chance she got. Max, on the other hand, was this big, calm teddy bear. When my mom mentioned they needed a dog sitter, my sister and I practically begged her to let us do it. I mean, how hard could it be? Watching dogs, living in a mansion for a week, and getting paid. It sounded like the easiest money ever. The Wilsons agreed, and my sister Katie offered to stay with me for the first night since she thought I'd get freaked out alone in a house that size. That first evening started off great. Katie was on the treadmill in their home gym, and I was downstairs in the basement lounging on their massive couch, binge-watching a movie. Everything was chill until I heard the door alarm beep. You know, that sound when the front door opens? At first I thought it was just the movie, but a few minutes later Katie came into the room looking annoyed. "Did you leave the front door open?" she asked. I froze. No, I don't think so." "Well, it's wide open now. I saw it on the security feed." That's when my stomach sank. I suddenly remembered I hadn't locked the front door earlier. I scrambled upstairs, Katie right behind me, and sure enough, the door was open, just slightly, like someone had pushed it but didn't come in. Katie tried to calm me down. "Relax. If someone had come in, the dogs would have gone nuts. Max would have barked at least." She had a point. Max and Luna were lying in the gym like nothing had happened. We locked the door, double-checked all the windows, and decided to call it a night. But I couldn't shake this feeling that we weren't alone. I was barely asleep when Luna's low growl woke me up. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. Max was standing by the door, staring at it completely still. He wasn't growling, but his tail was stiff, and he had this intense look in his eyes like he was waiting for something. "What's going on?" Katie mumbled, half asleep. "I don't know," I whispered. "The dogs are acting weird." Then I heard it, faint footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate like someone was trying not to be heard. My chest tightened. "Katie," I whispered. "Someone's in the house." She shot up, grabbing her phone. "Call Dad," she said, trying to stay calm. But when she tried to dial, her face went pale. "I don't have service." I checked my phone. Nothing. No bars. That's when the alarm beeped again. The front door. Luna started barking hysterically, her paws scratching at the door like she was trying to dig her way out. Max, though, stayed silent, his ears pinned back, growling so low it sent chills down my spine. Katie grabbed a lamp off the nightstand and whispered, "We're not leaving this room. Lock the door." I locked it and grabbed the tablet the Wilsons had left to monitor the cameras. My hands were shaking as I tapped the screen, switching between the feeds. That's when I saw it. In the hallway upstairs, a door opened slowly. The camera didn't show anyone, but the door swung wide like someone invisible had pushed it. "Katie, look," I whispered, showing her the screen. Her face turned white. "What the hell is that?" We stayed locked in that room, shaking as the footsteps got louder, moving closer to the stairs. The footsteps stopped just outside our door. Max started barking now, deep and guttural, while Luna was almost screaming at the door. I thought for sure whoever or whatever it was would break in. Then the front door alarm went off again. Beep. It was enough to make the dogs go quiet, and for a second, I thought maybe the person had left. But then I heard heavy breathing, right outside the door. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I grabbed the lamp from Katie and opened the door just a crack. Max and Luna bolted out, barking and snarling as they ran down the hall. Katie screamed at me to close the door, but I couldn't. I was frozen. That's when I saw it, on the camera feed. A figure in a dark hoodie stood in the living room, staring directly at the camera, not moving, but in real life. The living room was empty. Katie finally pulled me back into the room and locked the door. Moments later, we heard our dad yelling from downstairs. He'd made it to the house. We ran out to meet him, the dogs following close behind. He had his gun drawn, checking every room. But whoever, or whatever, had been there, was gone. The cops arrived a few minutes later. They checked the house and found no signs of forced entry, but they said it looked like someone had been inside. While they reviewed the camera footage, my dad came back to the car where we were waiting. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "What did the cameras show?" I asked. He just shook his head and said, "You're never coming back here again." We never did. To this day, I don't know what those cameras captured or who or what was in that house. Part of me wants to know, but most of me? I think I'm better off not finding out.